Gonzaga's season has not gone remotely to plan, but the NCAA tournament resume is not nearly as bad as it may seem.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, folks, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Well, the Zags are not getting any closer to getting back into the top 25 of the AP poll, but their resume is still in a pretty good place, not just for making the NCAA tournament, but for potentially still getting a single-digit seed. We're going to talk about that. We're going to break it all down, take a look at their advanced numbers, take a look at what games they have left on their schedule, how we think they need to do to get certain seeds in the NCAA tournament. And then we're going to close out the show talking a little bit more about the on-court stuff. What does Gonzaga specifically need to do differently on the basketball court over their next 8 regular season games and into the WCC tournament to get the wins that they need, to avoid the losses they do not need, and to find themselves in a favorable position, or as favorable of a position as they're going to get when March and Selection Sunday rolls around. So one of the things we're going to talk about here in the first segment is Gonzaga's, how they are ranked in the advanced analytics models. And we've talked about it a lot on the podcast. We referenced the net rankings. We referenced KenPom. We've referenced Bart Torvik. And one of the conversations that has happened quite a bit this year amongst those of us on the Locked On Zags Discord channel, amongst people on various other social media sites, Twitter, Blue Sky, etc., and amongst people on Reddit, and just the general discourse around this Gonzaga basketball team is that the analytics, the computer models, tend to like Gonzaga better than their actual performance on the floor has seemed to indicate. And I want to touch on that and talk about that because that still matters. It matters fairly significantly because right now, as I'm recording this on Monday afternoon, Gonzaga is 13th in the net rankings. They are 11th at KenPom, and they are 8th at Bart Torvik. Has Gonzaga played like the 8th, 11th, or 13th best team in college basketball? No. Do they deserve to be ranked in the AP poll anywhere close to those numbers? No. Will they get seeded in the NCAA tournament as a 2, 3, or 4 seed based on being in those numbers in the advanced computer models? No. Barring an incredible move by the selection committee, which would cause lots of vitriol, that is not going to happen for Gonzaga, even if they win the rest of their basketball games this season. But it matters that Gonzaga is viewed this favorably by Net, KenPom, and Bart Torvik for a fairly simple reason. Those 3 metrics are utilized on the team sheets given to the Selection Sunday committee when they make their decisions about seeding teams in the NCAA tournament. There is a select group of stats, of websites, of pages that are used by the committee. This is a dictated thing. It's not just, obviously they are allowed to use other metrics. They're not pigeonholed, but these are the specific ones that are referenced for the Selection Sunday committee. Torvik was added this year. Net obviously is a fairly new system, but it is a widely regarded system utilized by the committee. KenPom, of course, has been around since the late 90s, has been used in terms of Selection Sunday evaluations for a while as well. These things matter because the committee legitimately uses them to help determine NCAA tournament seeding. Again, it is not a be-all, end-all. There are not committee members, at least I assume there are not committee members who blindly look at Net and KenPom and Torvik and just seed teams based on that. That has not happened, and it should not happen. It is not. It is a piece of the puzzle, an important piece, a valuable piece, but it is a piece. Your actual record, your recent performance, unconscious biases, everything else goes into this by the committee to determine it, where these teams should be. There's obviously other random factors too. Gonzaga got bumped up a seed line last year because BYU doesn't play on Sundays. That's just the kind of thing that occasionally happens when making these seeding determinations by this committee. They got a lot of different things they have to tangle and untangle to put together this bracket every single year. But while yes, Gonzaga should not get a 4 seed, they should not get it's reasonable that they finish out this year in the top 20 in the net, or in the top 15 even in the net. It's not crazy to think that that could happen. And I'm telling you right now, they're not going to get a 4 seed if they do that, because the committee will look at Gonzaga's resume. They'll look at the fact that, yes, all their losses are close, which is why the computers like them, because the computers are not taking into account a lot. I mean, the computers they're math, they're not able to take in the human element. The fact that Gonzaga can't close out basketball games is an incredibly frustrating issue for us as fans. And it makes us look more negatively on a team that has 7 losses, that their marquee wins haven't aged as well. Although shout out Baylor for getting a nice 20-point comeback win over Kansas over the weekend. That was really helpful for the Zags. But the computers see a team that blows a lot of teams out, and that when they lose very close games. And so the computers are going to value Gonzaga, who has this elite offense. Every metric out there has Gonzaga as one of the 10 or 5 best offenses in the country, a team that generally actually has decent defensive numbers, although those numbers have cratered recently, even against St. Mary's, though. The overall defensive numbers in that game, not bad from a metrics perspective. From an eye test perspective, Gonzaga was absolute dog crap in the first half of that game, or first half. Got a little better in the start of this, or a little better in the rest of the first half, much, much better in the second half. We know that, we saw that, but the computers saw a game for Gonzaga, which was pretty good defensively. So again, not saying that the computers, I'm not trying to make the argument that Gonzaga is actually a top 15 team in the country because KenPom and Net and Torvik say so. I'm saying that they will probably not be treated as harshly as even Gonzaga fans at this point may treat Gonzaga, because those computer systems are something that are utilized and are working currently in Gonzaga's favor. Here are some key points to this. Right now, the lowest team in the history of the net, which is not super old, net hasn't been around for that long, but the net ranking, the lowest team in the end of the season in net ranking to not get an at-large bid in the NCAA tournament was last year. It was the Sycamores of Indiana State. They were 29th. Gonzaga is 13th. What Gonzaga would have to do to drop from 13 to 29 is fairly significant. Now, it doesn't mean that Gonzaga couldn't reset the record. It doesn't mean that Gonzaga could, go 1-2 or 0-3 in the remaining quad 1 games. Baylor drops out of the quad 1 situation. They are like 2-8 in quad 1 games. They finish 25th in the net, and they become the highest team to not make it. That is a possibility. I think it is a very slim possibility, but it is a possibility. But right now, Gonzaga is way farther up in the net than even the highest ranked team that has ever missed the tournament has ever been. Again, that makes Gonzaga feel fairly safe in terms of making the tournament. Doesn't mean we're going to like the seed. Doesn't mean we're going to love where they end up in the tournament. Doesn't mean we're going to feel super confident on Selection Sunday about the Sweet 16 streak lasting, or even the streak of not losing the first game in the NCAA tournament. But in terms of feeling confident about making the big dance, that stat is pretty darn telling. From a KenPom perspective, similar data, the highest ranked teams at KenPom at the end of the season to not miss the NCAA tournament, going back to 2002 when KenPom's data first came into play. South Carolina back in 2002, they were 22nd. Missouri State in 2006, they were 22nd. Air Force in 2007, they were 24th. Florida State in 2004, they were 25th. And St. Mary's, 28th. That was in 2018, when it was very shocking that they were left out of the tournament. But a couple things here. One, Gonzaga's 10 spots higher than every single one of those teams currently at KenPom. 11th, again, the highest team here is 22nd. Two, most of these happened very early in the KenPom era. KenPom's data has been refined since then. It is better at giving an accurate picture of where these teams should be ranked. And more importantly than that, our understanding and the Selection Sundays committee's understanding of these advanced numbers of what KenPom's data means, and net, and at the time, obviously RPI and everything else, is stronger. That is why you see much less of top 25 teams at KenPom, and almost very few teams anywhere close to this not making it from the net, because we understand these numbers better. So on eye test look at Gonzaga sees, wow, they've played a lot of close games, but most of the time they've played a good team, they've lost. That is a factual statement, and the eye test points to that. But people have a better understanding that there is more to it than that, and that Gonzaga's ability to never get blown out, to be in close games. I mean, their largest margin of defeat this year is 8 points. It happened twice. Both those games went into overtime. That doesn't even really count as an 8-point loss. It does, but it's not really an 8-point loss. Gonzaga has been in a position to win every single game that they have played this year. It makes the fact that they have 7 losses excruciating. But it is also why their resume is not nearly as problematic as other teams on the bubble, teams like North Carolina or Wake Forest or Pitt or other teams like that, where a couple times a season they just get waxed. They just get absolutely spanked. I do not believe Gonzaga would beat Duke right now, but I don't think they would lose as badly as North Carolina did last weekend. For example, that is helping Gonzaga, is helping them significantly in terms of where they are at right now. The resume doesn't look great. Even the net, like they're 2-6 in quad 1 games. Every team ahead of them has more than 2 quad 1 wins. In fact, the only team in the top 25 that has 2 or less quad 1 wins is St. John's. They have 1. They're 1-3. They're 24th in the net. So Gonzaga's resume is kind of odd, but they're not alone in being a 6 or 7 loss team. In fact, Illinois is a 7-loss team. They're 12th, 1 spot ahead of Gonzaga. Kansas and Arizona are 9th and 11th, respectively. They are both have 6 losses, only 1 less than Gonzaga. They all 3 of those teams have more quad 1 wins than Gonzaga, of course. But it's worth highlighting that Gonzaga's resume and their net ranking puts them in a position where they're a little bit more comfortable than maybe it feels to us as fans watching this team's excruciating season as it continues to unfold in front of us. Gonzaga, again, 2-6 quad 1, 3-1 in quad 2, 4-0 quad 3, 7-0 in quad 4. We're keeping an eye on Baylor, who's 27th. If they fall out of the top 30, that will become a quad 2 win. That's a big one for Gonzaga right now. That win over Kansas, extra helpful, like I said. West Virginia's 40th. They've been climbing up, but if they fall out of the top 50, that loss becomes a quad 2 loss. LMU, 139th, 4 spots away if they move into the top 135. That win Gonzaga has over them would go from quad 3 to quad 2. Now Gonzaga plays LMU on Thursday, so obviously the Zags will win. If the Zags win that game, then LMU will fall further in the net, albeit probably not that far. But those are the games to keep an eye on for right now. Now what I want to do is talk about what's left. What's next? Gonzaga's still got 3 quad 1 games on the schedule. That's not even including the WCC tournament. We're going to talk about what the Zags need to do to avoid being sweaty on Selection Sunday. We'll also talk some potential seeding in the big dance, all that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, are you looking for tickets to your next big event? Whether it's a concert, a comedy show, or a sporting event, finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache. With Gametime Picks, it's never been easier. Let me tell you how it works. Gametime Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. I've been using Gametime Picks for a while now, and here's why I love it. Not only does it show you only the best deals, the app has a view from your seat feature so you can see exactly what you're going to be seeing on game day. And the best part, you're covered with Gametime's lowest price guarantee. If you find a better deal somewhere else, they'll refund you 110% of the difference. Plus, your tickets are guaranteed to be delivered on time with easy cancellation options if something comes up. Are you ready to make your next event even better? Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking about Gonzaga's resume. We're still talking about what games they have left on their current schedule and kind of what wiggle room the Zags have right now in terms of still making the NCAA tournament, and then kind of some potential seeding projections based on how they could do going forward this season. So what's left for the Zags? Again, we've reiterated this point a handful of times this year, but it continues to be a huge benefit to Gonzaga that there are a lot more quad 1 and quad 2 opportunities in the WCC this year than there have been in the past. Gonzaga has not taken nearly enough advantage of those games. That is obviously the big problem for this team at this point, is that they have a great schedule. They've had so many chances for quad one wins and they keep blowing them. They blew it this last weekend against St. Mary's. We've seen them blow it against Oregon State, West Virginia, Kentucky. List goes on and on and on. You don't need a recap of all the losses. We've felt every single one of them already this year. But right now, with 8 remaining games in the regular season, Gonzaga still has 3 quad one games left. Also, perhaps to their advantage, those are the final 3 games of the regular season. Gonzaga's got 5 games, 2 quad 2, 1 quad 3, 2 quad 4 are among their next 5 games. And then they close out the season at home against St. Mary's, and then on the road against Santa Clara, and then on the road against San Francisco. Right now, all 3 of those games are of the quad 1 variety. San Francisco is kind of on the borderline right now. It's possible that game ends up quad 2 by the time that rolls around. But right now, all 3 of those are quad 1 games. Quad 2 games, San Francisco at home, and then Washington State on the road. That's one of the trickiest games left for Gonzaga, in the sense that it is a regional rivalry game against a team that isn't playing all that well, but could be a trap game for the Zags. Their 1 quad 3 game remaining is their upcoming game on Thursday at home against the Lions of LMU. And then their 2 quad 4 games are at Pacific, which is this weekend, and then later in the season when they host Pepperdine. Likely, we've mentioned this before, Gonzaga, if they get a double bye in the WCC tournament, like they always do, I think since that has existed, they've always gotten either a 1 or a 2 seed. They'll play 2 games in the WCC tournament. If they win that first game, I should say, the likely will be a quad 2 and then a quad 1 game. Not necessarily, but that is likely how it would go if they, again, make those 2 games in the WCC tournament. So what wiggle room do the Zags have? Well, obviously the margin of error is a lot thinner in terms of making the tournament and getting any kind of favorable seed. You've kind of exhausted a fair amount of your goodwill at this point. I think the Zags still make the dance if you win 2 of your 3 quad 1 games. That's assuming you don't win the WCC tournament. Obviously, if you win the WCC tournament, your seeding is still up in the air, but your spot in the dance is confirmed. So if you lose the WCC championship, or you lose the game before the WCC championship, if you win 2 quad 1 games, so if you beat Santa Clara on the road, if you beat St. Mary's, if you beat San Francisco, 2 of those 3 games, assuming USF stays quad 1, I think you still make the tournament even if you don't win the WCC tournament. But that is with everything else being a win. Can't lose at Wazoo. Can't lose at home to LMU on Thursday. You can't lose at home to San Francisco, which is a quad 2 game. The margin for error in terms of any bad losses is not there. Fortunately, Gonzaga doesn't have a lot of bad losses. The Santa Clara loss is a wicked loss in the sense of how it happened, and it is the worst looking loss from a resume perspective. It's not that terrible of a loss. It's not great. It's certainly not good in the context of the Zags having 6 other losses on top of it. But if that's your worst loss, it's not terrible. Most of the teams that are being floated around on the bubble right now have losses worse than that. At home is a bad part of the Santa Clara loss, but it's not the worst loss in the world. Again, it's just bad in the context of being one of 7 losses for Gonzaga this year. So what happens if the Zags win out? Best case scenario, let's talk about it. Zags win every regular season non-conference game going forward. They get probably the 2 seed in the WCC tournament. They beat, I don't know, let's say San Francisco or Santa Clara, and they play St. Mary's in the championship and they win that game. Let's say that happens. And let's assume that WCC title game is a quad 1 win, which it likely will be if it's against St. Mary's, and that semifinal game is a quad 2 win. If that happens, the Zags finish 6-6 in quad 1 games as it currently stands. Could be 5-6 if that San Francisco game doesn't stick. Could be 4-6 if the Baylor game doesn't stick. But right now, that would be 6-6. That would be 6-1 quad 2. Again, perhaps 7-1, perhaps 8-1, depending what happens with Baylor and San Francisco. And then that would be 14-0 combined quad 3 and quad 4. If this were to happen, 6-6 quad 1, 6-1 quad 2, you're probably still top 15 in the net. I mean, you're 13th right now. If you win every game from here on out, you're probably not dropping. Maybe you drop a little bit, worst case, but you're still top 15 almost certainly. I think realistically in this situation, a 500 record in quad 1 win, 500 record in quad 1 games with 5 or 6 wins, a very, very good record, only 1 loss between quad 2, 3, and 4, top 15 in the net. Folks, this team's probably a 5 seed, maybe a 6, maybe a 7 seed, but they're in a pretty good spot. This would be very reminiscent of what happened last year. It would be a remarkably similar story if Gonzaga were to win out from here on out. I know that the optimism, the vibes right now are not feeling great about that being something that happens. But again, they weren't last year either. They weren't last year either. This date, February 3rd, as I'm recording this, I believe was the date Gonzaga lost to St. Mary's at home last year. But then the next weekend they beat Kentucky, and then they rolled from there. It could happen. It could happen. And if it does, Gonzaga likely ends up in the same seeding conversation as they were last year. 5's the peak. 6 is probably the more likely outcome, maybe 7, depending on how some other things shake out. Again, win out, but Baylor and San Francisco drop, and you're 4 and 6. Then it's more likely in that 7 conversation, maybe 6, maybe 8, but you're still in a pretty good spot at that point. 8's not where you want to be, obviously, but I think if Gonzaga went out from here on out, they probably would avoid being an 8th seed at that point. What if you take a quad 1 loss and that's it? Again, either it's the WCC title game or it's one of the regular season games. And again, this is the flaw. There's a lot of flaws with the net system. It's not perfect. But right now, the committee is going to evaluate Gonzaga losing at Santa Clara differently than they would evaluate Gonzaga losing in the WCC championship game to St. Mary's. Like, those are going to be viewed, and they should be. They absolutely should be viewed differently. But the net is going to treat it the same. That's just the flaw of the net system. So just saying, here's their resume if they lose one more quad 1 game, it is a little bit flawed because the context is missing from there. But you'd have a 5 and 7 quad 1, again, potentially 4 and 7, depending on the San Francisco Baylor situation. Still be 6 and 1 quad 2. You'd still be perfect in quad 3, quad 4. You're probably still in that 7, 8, maybe 9 seed range again, depending on what that quad 1 loss is. Where you get dicey is if you only win one of your next 3 quad 1 games. Or if you only get one more quad 1 win, whether that's winning at getting swept by St. Mary's, winning at Santa Clara, winning at San Francisco, but it becomes a quad 2 win, or whether it's some other combination of those things. At that point, you're 4 and 8 in quad 1, potentially 3 and 8 if Baylor falls out, potentially 2 and 8 if San Francisco falls out. Now you're in a precarious situation. You're 2 and 8 in quad 1 wins, even if you beat St. Mary's at home. Let's say you're still only 2 and 8 in quad 1. Your only quad 1 wins are St. Mary's at home and San Diego State on the road. Baylor falls to quad 2. San Francisco falls to quad 2. You lose to Santa Clara, let's say. Then it's dicey. If you're 2 and 8, but you're top 20 in the net, you're still getting in, but you're probably like an 11 seed. If you're 2 and 8 and you're 25-ish in the net, then you run the risk of being the highest ranked net team to miss the tournament. I don't think the committee wants to keep Gonzaga out of the tournament, and I think if there's a justified reason to put them in, they're going to do it. But you never know. We were talking about how to avoid being sweaty on Selection Sunday. You only win one more quad 1 game, is going to be nerve-wracking on Selection Sunday. It's going to be nervous. We're not going to feel good. Even if the only quad 1 win you win is the WCC tournament, you're not as nervous because you know you're getting in the tournament, but you're going to be like an 11 seed, maybe a 10. Maybe you get a 10 seed. I guess that's better. I don't know. I'd almost rather be an 11 seed where you get a 6 seed followed by a 3 seed than a 10 seed where you get a 7 seed followed by a 2 seed after that. That's where it gets dicey. And all of this gets thrown out the window and becomes significantly murkier with any quad 2, quad 3, or of course, quad 4 losses. You got to take care of those games that are not quad 1 games. 5 regular season games remaining against non-quad 1 opponents, potentially 6 depending on San Francisco. Assuming you take care of business, assuming you don't have to play the crappy teams in the WCC tournament, you just got to take care of those 5 games. You got to win at Wazoo. You got to win at Wazoo. That's the tricky one. You got to win Thursday against LMU at home. You got to win those games. I'm not as concerned about Pacific and Pepperdine, but obviously you got to win them too. You got to win them too. That is the situation Gonzaga's in. Obviously winning the WCC tournament makes it so we're not worried about whether we're going to get into the dance or not, but outside of that, if you're not going to win that game, if there's concern about it, you got to take care of these other games. The margin for error is pretty close to gone right now. Gonzaga still makes the tournament with a loss or 2 this season. I believe that. But your odds of getting like on that dreaded 8-9 line where the Sweet 16 streak is very, very, very much in jeopardy become a lot higher if you don't take care of business against everybody except the best of the best. The next 5 games, the final 3 games of the regular season are the most important games for Gonzaga because they're all quad 1 games. But the next 5 games, they matter a heck of a lot too, in the sense that if you don't go 5-0 in this next stretch, you're starting to bank really hard on winning that WCC tournament to make sure you're not sweating on Selection Sunday. Well, let's talk about the on-court specifics. What does Gonzaga need to do on the floor to avoid those bad losses, to pick up enough marquee wins, to get safely into the field of 68? We're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to bring your favorite Zags to life. VarsityIcons.com delivers the ultimate collection of action figures that honors current and former Zags. Varsity Icons is the premier sports collectible figure for your Gonzaga Bulldogs. Today, we highlight everybody's fan favorite, Ben Gregg. Varsity Icons was started by a longtime Gonzaga fan who wanted to create collectible figures of everyone's all-time favorite Zags. The mission of Varsity Icons is to create figures of current and former Zags for everyone to collect and enjoy. There's no question that Varsity Icons wanted to highlight Ben Gregg to be the first player. He has been a fan favorite since joining the Zags back in 2021. Ben exemplifies what it means to be a Gonzaga Bulldog every time he steps on the court. We are excited to create more of your favorite Zags in the future, so stay tuned. And order your Varsity Icons Ben Gregg figure today at varsityicons.com. Varsity Icons, where icons live forever. All right, folks, closing out the show, we talked about Gonzaga's resume as it currently stands, including where they're at in the advanced analytics and how valuable those are in terms of the Selection Sunday's decisions when making the field of 68. We talked about the 8 remaining games in Gonzaga's schedule, what record we think they need to have, how they need to perform in those games, what they need to avoid doing in order to make sure they're safely in the field on Selection Sunday. And then we're going to close out the show talking more specifics on the actual court. Laid out a handful of things here that Gonzaga needs to do over the next 8 regular season games in order to avoid those bad losses, in order to pick up those marquee wins, and to kind of do what they did last year when they went on that big run at the end of the year. Right around this time last year, the trajectory has been very similar. Can they finish the season on a hot streak, win a couple quad one games to close out the regular season, and get a much higher seed than people anticipated at this point in the season last year? We'll talk about some of the keys here. Most of them defensive end of the floor. Not a surprise. This team is valued by almost every advanced analytics model as one of the 5 best offenses in the country. I believe Haslametrics have them 4th. I believe KenPom has them 4th as well. Like, this is one of the best offensive teams in the entire country. But they need to improve their man-to-man defense. That's number 1. More discipline in the man-to-man defense. Folks, it's been bad. Started out the year pretty good. Lately, bad. Was not terrible. Let me rephrase. The defense against St. Mary's was not terrible. The man-to-man defense was pretty bad. It was horrible against Santa Clara. I mean, just atrocious. In that game, it was bad in Corvallis. Against Oregon State as well. It was better against Oregon State the second time around, but it was quite bad the first time they faced them. It is an issue for this team. We talked specifically about one of the main things that they're doing that is problematic on that end of the floor, which is having their guards or their perimeter players pinch or move in towards a defender or a opponent who is driving towards the basket. They do this unnecessarily. They do this in situations where a player already got over the screen and does not need help from a secondary defender. Them doing so is allowing the player with the ball who's driving to turn and kick it out to a wide open 3-point shooter. Gonzaga's defenders are not able to recover in time to contest that shot, giving them wide open looks from 3. St. Mary's exploited the heck out of this in that game. Santa Clara exploited the heck out of this in their game as well. The amount of times where you'd see, whether it be Hickman or Nembhard or Stromer or whomever, would leave their player because Marcelonis was driving towards the rim, even though Innocenti or Stromer or whomever got around the screen and kept Marcelonis in front of them. They're still having that player come over and double and kind of swipe at the ball. Marcelonis and most good point guards recognize that player is coming, recognize that means the shooter's open, find the shooter. Usually the shooter has relocated, which makes the defender have to spend a split second longer trying to find him. By that point, that guy's got an open look from 3. Bang. 7 of 7 for Santa Clara in the first part of the second half in that game. 18 total made threes. St. Mary's made 7 threes in the first half. They averaged 7 made threes per game. It was a huge problem for Gonzaga in those 2 games, and it's been a problem prior to that. No reason to do that. No reason to do that defensively. First of all, improve on the screen navigation so that the other defenders don't feel like they have to pinch. But secondly, it's either a coaching decision that needs to change. Stop telling the players to do that. Or if they're not listening to you, play different players. Make adjustments to the lineup if you can't get the guys on the floor to do what you need them to do. That leads to the second point. More Emmanuel Innocenti. More of the Tarleton State transfer, who has been a phenomenal revelation for this program on the defensive end of the floor since he entered the starting lineup 2 weeks ago against Portland. Gonzaga lost by 4 to St. Mary's. Pretty much every player on Gonzaga was minus in the plus-minus in that game. One of the only exceptions was Emmanuel Innocenti. He was +5 in 28 minutes of action, for Gonzaga against St. Mary's. I believe Braden Huff was positive as well, as like +1, +2. He didn't play very much. I think he only played like 9 minutes in that game. So for Innocenti to be +5 in a significant amount of playing time, Caleb Battle was -8. Dusty Stromer was negative. Like, Innocenti had, again, I've said this before, 1 game samples on plus minus are not always the most, you want to take them with a grain of salt, but Innocenti was clearly effective defensively in that game. He also had 4 points, 2 of 3 shooting. He missed a 3-pointer, but was effective on the other 2 shots he took. He doesn't demand the ball. He doesn't take a lot of shots. He doesn't take away offense from Nembhard or Ike or Hickman or anybody else on the floor. And he is the best screen navigator and best overall on-ball defender on this roster. He needs to play more. It appears that Mark Few has recognized that. Again, if Caleb Battle and Emmanuel Innocenti had played more similar minutes, we'd be a bit more critical right now. But the fact that Innocenti played 10 more minutes than Battle was a sign that Coach Few recognized that he was more valuable in that game and adjusted accordingly. We'll see what happens against LMU. More importantly, we'll see what happens later on down the line at Washington State. One of the other valuable things about Innocenti is a lot of the teams Gonzaga is playing for the second time, like LMU, like Washington State, like Santa Clara, won't have as much familiarity with him. So they'll have to re-scout. They'll have to kind of watch and see what he does. And he might be able to give a different look against teams that might start to feel a little bit comfortable against Gonzaga, having already played them this year. Key number 3, speaking of trying to make teams uncomfortable, change up the defense a little bit more. The zone defense was incredibly effective against St. Mary's. Part of that is because St. Mary's struggles against the zone defense. My good friend Zach Farmer, the host of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast, he said it on his show prior to the game on Saturday morning. He said, St. Mary's struggles against the zone, they struggle against press. If Gonzaga runs those things effectively, it could really slow them down. He was absolutely bang on about that. Gonzaga ran that zone in the second half, and St. Mary's inexplicably had no idea what to do. They couldn't penetrate. They couldn't get a player to flash up at the high post. They were just settling for open threes or settling for threes over defenders. They shot really poorly in the second half. Gonzaga climbed all the way back in that game and then very frustratingly blew it at the end of the game, but it worked. It's not going to work against everybody. Zone may not be the option. It may not be the answer against Santa Clara. It might not be what they do in that game. If that team's red hot from 3, that may not be what you want to do. But there might be situations where it's effective to try. Mark Few has historically been very hesitant to try zone defense, to try different defensive looks. And this is not the season to be hesitant about that. Roll it out there if you think it's going to work. Gonzaga looked more confident in their zone defense than they did in the man-to-man. Again, part of that, I think, is the St. Mary's of it all. And I think they had been prepared to utilize that, and the preparation worked. But if you can play it comfortably like they clearly could in that game, try it again. If you need to be able to utilize that, use more of the full court press, the half court traps. We see that sporadically for Gonzaga. Don't be afraid to try more of it. You got nothing to lose at this point. Go out, give it a shot, try some different things, give some new looks to some teams that might think they know what you're going to do. And then the last one here, obviously this is a huge issue for Gonzaga this year. You got to improve the late game execution. It's been catastrophic to watch the way Gonzaga handles late game situations. The only time they've had any semblance of a clutch play late in the game was the Graham Ike 3-pointer to send the Oregon State game in overtime. And then they got outscored by 8 in the final 5 minutes in overtime. They had some clutch shots against Kentucky. I'll give them that, but that was after they blew an 18-point lead early in the second half. So, you take that with a bit of a grain of salt. Yeah, they came back against Santa Clara, but it wasn't enough. And then Graham Ike got a technical foul, and it really, really hurt their chances of winning that basketball game. Gonzaga's shot the ball way too early when they had 3 or 4 more seconds to get off a good look. They did that against St. Mary's, and they did it against UCLA. They've committed costly turnovers at the end of games. They've missed free throws at the end of games. Ryan Nembhard's done it twice now. He did it once last year too. This team does not have that it factor at the end of games. And they can't just skate by, we just won't play close games. That's clearly not happening. Gonzaga's played 7 close games this year. They're 0-7 in those games. They haven't won a close game yet. This is a huge issue for Gonzaga. And in those quad 1 games that are remaining, they're probably going to be in close games. And if you can't figure out a way to win one of those games, you're going to be real sweaty on Selection Sunday. There's other things Gonzaga needs to do too. Get the transfers more involved. Find a way to get Caleb Battle more consistency. Figure out what's going on with Dusty Stromer. Like there's a handful of things, but those are some of the key things that I think will really help this team avoid any potential non-quad one losses in the 5 upcoming games and potentially pick up at least 2, if not ideally all 3 of those quad one opportunities to close out the season, putting yourself in a much, much more comfortable position going into the WCC tournament and then eventually the NCAA tournament as well. Going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much. To those of you who have made the show your first listen or your first watch of the day, appreciate every single one of you. We'll be back on Wednesday with some mailbag questions, some Zags and the NBA stuff, as we saw a trade earlier this week that has some impact with some Gonzaga players. And then we'll get you ready for that LMU game on Thursday and Pacific on Saturday. Thanks again, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.